The moment my fork hovered above the plate, everything changed. Something small and folded slid across the tablecloth toward me, pushed by trembling fingers so tiny they could barely manage the weight of what they carried. My granddaughter's hand shook as she withdrew it quickly, her eyes refusing to meet mine. I assumed it was another one of her drawings, perhaps a turkey traced from her palm or a pilgrim made of construction paper scraps. She had a habit of leaving me little treasures, notes decorated with lopsided hearts and flowers that never quite looked like flowers. But this napkin, this ordinary white square of paper, held something different. The blue ink was smeared in places, as though written in haste or fear. "Grandma, pretend you're sick and get out now." 6 words that made my throat close and my vision narrow. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. I simply stared at the shaky handwriting while my mind struggled to process what I was reading. Around me, the Thanksgiving celebration continued without pause. Wine glasses clinked together in toasts I hadn't heard. Laughter erupted from the far end of the table where my son sat with his wife Melissa and her parents. They seemed entirely too pleased with themselves, too jovial for a simple holiday dinner. When I finally looked up, my granddaughter's face told me everything I needed to know. Her eyes were wide and glassy with unshed tears, darting nervously between me and the adults who remained oblivious to our silent exchange. Something in her expression, a desperation I had never seen before, compelled me to act without hesitation or question. I placed my fork down with exaggerated care and pressed my palm against my chest, feeling my heart hammering beneath my ribs. "I'm not feeling well," I said softly, my voice barely carrying over the dinner conversation. The effect was immediate. All heads turned in my direction, the laughter dying away as though someone had flipped a switch. My son's face arranged itself into an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Really, Mom? Tonight?" His tone carried an undercurrent of irritation, the kind people use when they're annoyed but trying to hide it. "It's Thanksgiving." Melissa leaned toward him, whispering something behind her hand. I caught the slight upturn of her lips, a smirk she couldn't quite suppress. Something cold settled in my stomach. "I think I should go home and rest," I continued, pushing back from the table slowly. "It's been a long day." Nobody moved to help me. Not my son, not Melissa, not her parents who had been so warm and friendly when I arrived. Only my granddaughter stood, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I'll walk Grandma to the car," she announced, her voice higher than usual. Her mother began to protest about dessert, but the girl was already at my side, her small hand gripping mine with surprising strength. My son waved dismissively. Fine, just hurry back." The November air outside hit like a physical blow, cold and sharp and somehow more real than the warmth I'd left behind. My granddaughter didn't release my hand even as we walked down the driveway. Her fingers felt like ice, and I could feel them trembling against my palm. When we reached a mailbox, far enough from the house that our voices wouldn't carry, she finally spoke. "Grandma, they were talking about you before dinner." Her words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other. My heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She swallowed hard, glancing back at the lit windows of the house. "They said after tonight, you wouldn't be living alone anymore. They talked about papers in your house and something you signed. But Grandma, you're not forgetful." "I know you're not." I stopped walking. The streetlight above us flickered, casting strange shadows across her face. "What exactly did you hear?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, looking impossibly small in her cardigan. "I was in the hallway before dinner. Dad and Mom were in the kitchen with Grandpa Ron and Grandma Linda. They didn't know I was there. Dad said something about a medical evaluation that was already done. Mom laughed and said you didn't even know it happened." The words landed like stones in my chest. A medical evaluation. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. "Did they say what the papers were for?" I asked, though somewhere deep in my bones I already understood. She nodded, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "Your house. They kept calling it the property and the asset. Mom said once it was transferred, they could finally stop worrying about you being stubborn. And then..." Her voice broke. Then she mentioned a facility. She said you'd be happier there. A facility. They wanted to put me in a home and take everything I owned. I looked back at the warm glow emanating from the dining room windows, watching the silhouettes move inside, celebrating me. I realized with a sickening clarity, celebrating what they believed was already accomplished. I knelt down despite my protesting knees, taking both of my granddaughter's hands in mine. You did something incredibly brave tonight. You probably saved everything. She threw her arms around my neck, and I held her as tightly as I dared. This child who had more courage than the adults who raised her. When I drove home with her buckled safely in the passenger seat, my mind began working backward through recent weeks, piecing together moments I'd dismissed or misinterpreted. The unexpected visits from my son, always accompanied by Melissa, always with that folder of documents they claimed were routine paperwork. The way they'd begun speaking to me as though I were a child, enunciating carefully, explaining simple concepts I'd understood perfectly well. The comments about my garden being too much work, my house too large, my independence too risky. Last month, Melissa had insisted on accompanying me to a doctor's appointment. I thought it was thoughtful at the time, even touching. But now I remembered the unusual questions the doctor had asked. Questions about memory, orientation, cognitive function. I'd answered everything correctly and thought nothing more of it. Now I understood it had been a setup, an evaluation designed to create documentation they could weaponize against me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as rage and hurt warred inside my chest. My son, the boy I'd carried and birthed and raised, the child I'd sacrificed for countless times, had looked at me and seen nothing but assets to claim. He'd planned my future without consulting me, decided where I'd live and what I'd lose, all while I was still perfectly capable of making my own decisions. They'd nearly succeeded. If not for a 10-year-old girl with a napkin and a pen, I would have walked directly into their trap. After dropping my granddaughter back at the house, ensuring she went inside safely, I drove home through streets I'd traveled for 40 years. The silence in the car felt profound, the kind of silence that precedes important decisions. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for several minutes with the engine off, staring at the porch light I'd left burning that morning. This house represented 4 decades of my life. 40 years of memories absorbed into every surface, every corner, every room. Inside, I stood in the entryway and truly looked at my home for the first time in months, perhaps years. When you inhabit a space for so long, it becomes invisible, just background scenery. But tonight, I saw everything with painful clarity. The small dent in the hallway wall where my son had ridden his bicycle indoors at age 8. I'd been furious that day, but I'd hugged him anyway when he cried, because that's what mothers do. The kitchen window where I'd stood washing dishes, while watching my husband work in the garage, humming off key, covered in grease, completely content. We'd purchased this house together when we were young and optimistic and barely able to scrape together the down payment. It had been smaller then, before the additions and renovations, before we transformed it into the home we'd dreamed about on our wedding night. My husband had died 12 years ago, suddenly and without warning. One morning he was here, and by evening he wasn't. The grief had been overwhelming, but I'd stayed. I'd kept the house, paid off the mortgage with insurance money and my own savings. Every payment had come from my hands, my work, my sacrifice. This wasn't merely property. This was where I'd become a mother, where I'd cried after miscarriages, where I'd painted nurseries and survived sleepless nights with colicky babies, where I'd baked birthday cakes and sewn Halloween costumes and created Christmas memories. I walked into my son's old bedroom, now converted to a guest room, and closed my eyes. I could still see his posters, his trophies, his perpetually messy floor that I'd nagged him about endlessly. He used to tell me he loved me every night before bed, even as a teenager when his friends found it embarrassing. When had that boy disappeared? When had he started viewing me as a burden rather than his mother? I remembered when Melissa first saw this house after their engagement. She'd smiled politely, but I'd overheard her whisper to my son in the kitchen about how outdated everything was, how they'd definitely want to renovate before selling. Even then, Even before marriage, she'd been calculating what to do with my home, and my son had simply nodded, agreeing as though my future was already decided. Over the years, their comments had grown bolder, suggestions that I downsize, that the yard was too much work, that I'd be happier somewhere simpler. I deflected these remarks, changed subjects, refused to engage. But they'd been planting seeds, preparing the ground, wearing down my resistance. Well, I wasn't worn down. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood I knew intimately. I'd watched children grow up here, brought casseroles to new neighbors, attended block parties, shoveled Mrs. Patterson's driveway after her husband passed. This was my life, my community, my history. They thought they could erase 40 years with a few signatures, reduce my existence to paperwork and property transfers. I felt something crystallize inside me. Not exactly anger, but something colder and more focused. If they wanted my house, they'd have to drag me out. And even then, I'd ensure they inherited nothing but walls and regret. Sleep eluded me that night. My mind kept circling back to 2 weeks earlier, when pieces of this puzzle had been laid out before me and I'd chosen not to see them. It had been a Tuesday afternoon, my regular grocery day. I just returned home when my son's car appeared in the driveway. He'd brought Melissa, and they'd been carrying takeout from the Chinese restaurant downtown, the one with orange chicken I particularly enjoyed. Surprise, my son had said, grinning in a way that didn't extend to his eyes. Thought we'd have lunch with you. I'd been genuinely pleased. Their visits had become increasingly rare, and I'd told myself it was natural, that life gets busy. We'd sat at the kitchen table, the same one where my granddaughter would later slip me that warning note. Melissa had been unusually talkative, complimenting my curtains, asking about my book club, inquiring about my sleep patterns. "You look tired, Mom," my son had said, patting my hand. "Are you getting enough rest?" I'd laughed, making some joke about being 72 and tired being part of the package. But he hadn't laughed. Instead, he'd exchanged a significant look with Melissa, one of those wordless conversations married couples have. "Actually, Mom, that's kind of why we're here. We've been worried about you." Melissa had leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness, explaining that living alone wasn't safe anymore, that I wasn't getting any younger. As if I didn't wake up every morning acutely aware of my age, feeling it in every joint and muscle. "I'm perfectly fine," I'd insisted. "I've been managing this house longer than you to have been married." That's when my son had produced the folder, thick and official looking, documents about protecting me and my assets. I'd opened it to find pages of legal jargon, signature lines highlighted in yellow. "This seems extensive," I'd said carefully. "Perhaps I should have my own lawyer review it." The temperature in the room had dropped immediately. My son's jaw had tightened. Melissa's smile had frozen on her face. They'd argued that we were family, that involving lawyers was unnecessary, even insulting, but I'd held firm, said I'd think about it. They'd left shortly after, the takeout barely touched, their smiles evaporated. "Don't take too long," my son had said at the door. "These things have deadlines." Now, sitting in my living room at 2 in the morning, I understood completely. They hadn't needed my permission, just my signature. When I wouldn't provide it willingly, they'd decided to obtain it through deception. The medical evaluation, the notary at Thanksgiving, forged documents if necessary. I didn't return to bed. Instead, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I've always thought better with pen and paper. I documented everything, every visit, every comment, every attempt to push those documents at me, every strange question from that doctor's appointment. By sunrise, I had 3 pages filled with evidence and a plan forming in my mind. At 9 o'clock sharp, I called my granddaughter's cell phone. She answered quietly, probably at school. "Sweetheart, I need your help today. Can you tell your mother you're not feeling well and need to stay with me?" After a brief pause, she agreed without questions, trusting me completely. An hour later, she sat in my passenger seat as we drove downtown. She'd told her mother she had a headache. Melissa hadn't even argued, probably relieved. "Where are we going?" she asked. "First the bank," I replied. "Then to see a lawyer." Her eyes widened, but she simply nodded. The bank was quiet that morning. Mr. Peters, the branch manager who'd known me for nearly 20 years, welcomed us warmly. When I explained that I needed enhanced security measures because family members might attempt to access my accounts without permission, his expression grew serious. That happens more often than people realize, he said sympathetically. He set up additional authentication requirements, ensuring that even with power of attorney documents, nothing could occur without my explicit in-person consent. He also gave me a business card for the bank's elder protection specialist. "You're doing everything right," he told me with respect in his voice. After the bank, I took my granddaughter to a small diner near the courthouse. She ordered pancakes despite it being noon, and I didn't say a word about it. Some rules deserve to be broken. "Are you scared?" she asked between bites. "A little," I admitted, "but mostly I'm angry." And anger, when channeled properly, can be powerful. At 2 o'clock, we entered the law office of Catherine Mills, an attorney my neighbor had recommended after her own son attempted something similar years ago. Catherine was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 50, with short gray hair and sharp eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. She listened to my entire account without interruption. I showed her my notes, the timeline, everything my granddaughter had overheard. When I finished, Catherine leaned back and studied me for a long moment. "Mrs. Harrison, what you're describing is textbook elder financial abuse, possibly fraud if they forged anything. Can you help me?" She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a warrior preparing for battle. "Absolutely. We're going to create a revocable living trust. We'll transfer your home and major assets into it. Even if they somehow obtained power of attorney documents, they couldn't touch anything. The trust protects you." "How long will that take?" I asked. "If we move quickly, a week or less." She turned to my granddaughter. "And you, young lady, are very brave. What you did might have saved your grandmother from losing everything." For the next hour, my granddaughter recounted every detail she'd overheard. Catherine documented it all meticulously. When we stood to leave, she put a hand on my shoulder. "People like your son and his wife count on you being too scared or ashamed to fight back. They count on silence." "I'm done being quiet," I said firmly. She grinned. "Good, because we're going to ensure they never touch what's yours again." 3 days later, my phone rang. I was preparing dinner when I saw my son's name on the screen. I let it ring twice more before answering, steadying my voice. "Hello." His voice was tight, strained. "Mom, we need to talk." I kept my tone light, casual. "Of course, dear. How are you?" "How am I?" He laughed bitterly. "I'm confused. Melissa's parents were upset about Thanksgiving. You just left without saying goodbye, without finishing dinner." I stirred the pot on the stove calmly. "I wasn't feeling well." I mentioned that. There was a pause, his frustration audible in his breathing. "Listen, Mom, about the paperwork we discussed." "What paperwork?" I asked innocently. His tone sharpened. "The documents. The ones from 2 weeks ago. You said you'd think about it." I opened the refrigerator, pulling out vegetables with deliberate slowness. "Oh, those? Yes. I've been thinking." Another pause. "And I'm still considering my options." "Mom, we don't have time for this." There it was, the impatience breaking through. "These things have deadlines, legal windows. If we don't handle this soon, it becomes much more complicated." "Complicated for whom?" I asked. Silence. "For you," he said finally. "For your protection. We're trying to help you." I wanted to scream, to demand when he'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a problem requiring a solution. But I maintained my calm. "I appreciate your concern. Do you?" His voice rose. "Because it doesn't feel like it. We've been trying to help for months, and you keep pushing back. It's like you don't trust us." Should I? The question escaped before I could stop it. Another pause, longer this time. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, dear. I'm just tired." He sighed heavily. "Look, the notary we had lined up for Thanksgiving is willing to come to your house Wednesday afternoon, 20 minutes tops. Just sign the papers and we can all move forward." "What exactly am I signing?" "We've been over this. Power of attorney, medical directives, property transfer into a family trust. Standard stuff for someone your age." There it was again. Someone your age. And if I don't want to sign? His voice went cold. Then we'll have to pursue other options. Legal options. We already have the medical evaluation showing cognitive decline. We have documented evidence of forgetfulness and poor judgment. If you won't do this voluntarily, we can have you declared incompetent. My hand tightened around the phone. The threat was finally laid bare. But instead of fear, I felt clarity, certainty. I see, I said quietly. Mom, we don't want it to come to that. Just sign the papers. Make this easy. I injected a note of resignation into my voice. I suppose you're right. I have been feeling forgetful lately. I could practically hear him relax. See, that's good, Mom. Really good. So Wednesday works? Let me check my calendar and call you back. Don't take too long. Richard says the window for doing this voluntarily closes soon. I understand, I said softly. Good. I'm glad you finally understand. We're doing this because we love you. I looked out the window at the garden I'd planted, the trees I'd watched grow, the home I'd built with my own hands and heart. Yes, I said. I understand perfectly. After hanging up, I immediately called Catherine Mills. They're planning to come Wednesday with forged documents and threats. Perfect, she said. By Wednesday, your trust will be filed and recorded. Let them come. Let them try. They didn't wait until Wednesday. On Monday afternoon, a car door slammed in my driveway. Through the window, I saw my son's silver sedan. Both he and Melissa wore business casual attire. She carried that same thick folder. They were coming to ambush me, catch me off guard. I almost smiled. I opened the door before they could knock. This is a surprise. My son looked uncomfortable. Hey, Mom. We were in the neighborhood. Thought we'd stop by. Save you a trip Wednesday. How thoughtful, I said, stepping aside. They walked past me into the living room. Melissa set her purse and the folder on the coffee table with a decisive thud. We brought the documents. Richard looked everything over. All you need to do is sign and initial in a few places. Would you like some tea? I offered. My son waved his hand impatiently. We're fine. Let's just get this done. I sat in my armchair, the one my husband used to read the Sunday newspaper in. They sat on the couch, the coffee table between us, like a battlefield. Melissa opened the folder and spread documents across the surface, pages of legal text with signature lines marked by colored tabs. This one is the power of attorney, she explained, pointing. This gives us authority to handle your finances and make medical decisions if you're unable to. My son slid another document forward. And this one transfers the house into a family trust for estate planning purposes to avoid probate. I picked up the first document and pretended to read it carefully. Let them believe I was considering it. It's a lot to take in, I said slowly. We know, Melissa said, her voice syrupy. That's why we're here, to explain anything you don't understand. I set the papers down and looked at them both. Really looked at them. My son avoiding eye contact. Melissa with her practiced smile. Before I sign anything, I said, I have a question. Of course, my son replied. When were you planning to tell me about the medical evaluation? His face drained of color. What medical evaluation? Melissa said quickly, her voice too high, too defensive. The one you arranged without my knowledge. The one where the doctor asked me questions about my memory, my cognitive function. The one you're planning to use to prove I'm incompetent if I don't sign these papers willingly. The silence in the room was absolute. Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. My son started, but I held up my hand. Please don't insult my intelligence. Melissa's smile vanished. Look, we were just being thorough, making sure you were okay. To build a case against me, you mean? My son stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. We're trying to help you, and you're acting paranoid. Sit down, I said quietly. Something in my tone made him pause, made him sit back down. I reached beside my chair and pulled out my own folder, considerably thicker than theirs. I set it on the coffee table between us. What's that? Melissa asked, her voice uncertain. Legal filings I made last week, I said calmly. With my attorney. My son's jaw tightened. What attorney? Catherine Mills. Perhaps you've heard of her. She specializes in elder law, specifically protecting seniors from financial exploitation. I opened the folder and slid a document toward them. This is a revocable living trust. My house, my savings, my assets are all protected now. Even if you somehow manage to get power of attorney, you can't touch any of it. Melissa snatched up the document, her eyes scanning frantically. You can't do this without consulting us, actually. I can. It's my property, my money, my life. But we're family, my son said, his voice cracking. Family doesn't forge signatures, I replied. Family doesn't try to have their mother declared incompetent so they can steal her home. We weren't stealing anything, Melissa snapped. We were protecting your assets. I pulled out another paper. This is interesting. It's a report from a handwriting analyst. She compared signatures you submitted to the county last month with my actual signature. My son's face went from pale to gray. Turns out they don't match, which means you attempted fraud, forgery, both of which are crimes. We didn't forge anything, Melissa said, but her hands were shaking. Then explain how documents with my supposed signature were filed at the county recorder's office when I never signed them, when I never even saw them. They looked at each other, trapped. My attorney has copies of everything. The forged documents, the medical evaluation I didn't consent to, the timeline of your visits and manipulation attempts. I paused. And she has a witness statement from someone who overheard you planning all of this. Who? My son demanded. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. Melissa stood abruptly. This is insane. We were trying to help you. Help yourselves, maybe. I stood, walked to the door, and opened it. I think it's time for you to leave. Mom, my son said, his voice pleading now. Don't do this. We can work something out. We could have, I said, if you'd asked instead of plotted. If you'd treated me like a person instead of an obstacle. Melissa grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. My son followed more slowly, looking back at me with something between anger and desperation. At the doorway, he stopped. You're making a mistake. No, I said quietly. You made the mistake. You should have known better than to underestimate me. They left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, listening to their car start and drive away. Then I walked back to my chair, sat down, and released a long, slow breath. It was done. The house felt different after they left. Quieter, but not lonely. Peaceful. I called my granddaughter that evening and asked if she could stay the night. Her mother agreed without hesitation, probably relieved to have her out of the house while they dealt with their humiliation. When she arrived with her overnight bag, I had hot cocoa waiting on the stove, made with real milk and melted chocolate, not powder from a packet. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our mugs. Did they come? She asked. They came. What happened? I reached across and squeezed her hand. You saved me. That's what happened. Everything I was able to do, I did because you warned me that night. She looked down at her cocoa. I was so scared. I thought maybe I shouldn't say anything, that maybe I heard wrong, but you trusted your instincts. That's brave. Are you mad at them? She asked, looking up at me with those wide, serious eyes. I thought about it for a moment. Really thought about it. No, I said finally. I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. And disappointment is different from anger. Anger burns hot and fades, but disappointment stays. It changes how you see someone. She nodded slowly, processing this. Will they come back? They might try, I said. But if they do, my attorney will handle it. I don't have to fight them face to face anymore. The law will do that for me. She sipped her cocoa and got a little chocolate mustache on her upper lip. I reached over with a napkin and wiped it away. For a moment, we both smiled. That night, she slept in the guest room, and I slept better than I had in weeks. The letters started arriving about a week later. First from their attorney, Richard, a formal demand for reconsideration of family property distribution. My attorney, Catherine, responded with an equally formal letter explaining there was nothing to reconsider. The property was legally protected, and any further harassment would result in a restraining order. Then came a letter from my son, Hendridan. 3 pages about how hurt he was, how I'd misunderstood their intentions, how they were only trying to help. I read it once and filed it away. Didn't respond. 2 weeks after that, they showed up at church. I saw them walk in during the opening hymn, sliding into a pew near the back. Melissa had her hand on my son's arm, both wearing their Sunday best and their most pious expressions. After the service, they tried to approach me in the fellowship hall. My son opened his mouth to speak, but I simply smiled, took my granddaughter's hand, and walked past them. People notice things in small communities. Whispers start spreading. I never said a word against them. Never had to. The truth has a way of revealing itself. A month passed, then two. Their calls stopped. The letters stopped. They finally realized there was nothing left to take. Nothing left to manipulate. Last night, I stood by my bedroom window looking out over the backyard. The garden needed weeding. The fence needed painting. All the tasks that come with owning a home. But they were my tasks. My home. My choice. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from my granddaughter. "Good night, Grandma. I love you. I'm glad you're safe." I typed back slowly, my old fingers clumsy on the small keyboard. "Because of you I am." When I turned off the light and climbed into bed, I thought about everything that had happened. How close I'd come to losing it all. Not just the house, but my independence, my dignity, my right to live my own life on my own terms. For years, I'd believed that family was everything, that blood ties were unbreakable, that love would always protect. But I learned something important these past few months. Sometimes the people who love you most aren't the ones you're related to. Sometimes it's a 10-year-old girl with a napkin and the courage to tell the truth. And sometimes survival isn't about fighting back loud and hard. Sometimes it's about being smart, being prepared, knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground. I thought revenge would feel explosive, satisfying in some dramatic way. But it didn't. It felt like silence. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the wind stops howling and the rain stops falling and you realize you're still standing, still here, still home.